begin with your 30mm chessboard stone, and you're going to start by gluing it down to your square of black non-woven stitching base or beading foundation. You can use any kind of glue compatible with jewelry, with stones. I'm using this non-toxic rhinestone adhesive from Dreamtime Creations, but you can use E6000 or any type of super glue that's compatible with jewelry and gems. And just going to place it down and allow that to dry. Once the glue has dried on your chessboard stone, needle up a comfortable working length of thread. This one's about almost a wingspan, and tie a knot on the end, or just weave it back and forth through the beading foundation to get it anchored close to the edge of the stone. So stitch up from back to front. I've got my knot on there, so that should hold it, but even so I like to do a couple small stitches just for extra assurance that the knot won't get pulled through the beading foundation. Alright, now you're going to start back stitching your initial row of beads for the bezel by picking up 2 cylinders and then stitching down about 2 cylinders away from where your thread is coming out, and then stitching back up from front to back right before the first cylinder. And then through both cylinders. So then that's the start. From then on you'll pick up 2 cylinders, stitch down about 2 beads width away. Make sure that they sit right up against the edge of the chessboard stone. And then stitch up from back to front, making sure your needle comes out between the 3rd bead back and the 4th bead back. And it should be like right in between those beads, and then stitch through the last 3 beads added. So that's the pattern. You'll then repeat all the way around. Pick up 2, go down 2, stitch up between the 3rd and 4th bead back, and stitch through 3. And just work all the way around till you get back to the beginning, making sure you add 2 beads at a time because you're going to need an even count for the next step. Once you've backstitched with cylinders all the way around, you may find that you have a little bit of a gap at the end. This would be the perfect size for 1 extra cylinder, but I can't add that because that would make my count even. So I'm just gonna kind of ignore it and stitch through the first cylinder added in the backstitched row to begin my first row of peyote stitch. So here I'm going to pick up a cylinder, skip over the next cylinder in the backstitched row, and stitch through the one after that. Now I'll just repeat that. Pick up a cylinder, skip over the next one in the row, and stitch through the one after that. So I'll just keep doing that all the way around. Once you reach the end of the round, after peyote stitching the last cylinder, step up through the first cylinder added in peyote stitch. Now the beads at the end here may sit a little funky if you had to leave a space like I did, but just try to get that last peyote stitched bead to sit on top of the one you skip over. Next, peyote stitch around with 11Ds. So pick up an 11D and stitch through the next cylinder that's sticking up or sitting on top of another cylinder. And do this all the way around. After adding the last 11D in the round, step up through the first 11D added. Then peyote stitch around with 11E. So pick up a bead, stitch through the next 11D from the previous round. Do that all the way around. Pull tight in this row to get your bezel to start cupping in around the chessboard stone. After adding the last 11E and peyote stitch, step up through the first 11E added. Then peyote stitch a row of 15 O's, adding one between each 11E in the previous round. After adding the last 15O in peyote stitch in the round, you don't have to step up. I usually do anyway, even if I'm not adding any other rows. And this last row should hold your bezel or hold your stone in the bezel pretty well. So you can just start weaving down the beads toward the beading foundation. And bring your needle actually through the beading foundation to the back. And then I'm just going to sort of do a little stitch here so that my thread is coming out on the inside of the threads that are all there. Because now what I have to do is cut out this circle as closely as possible, cut out the beading foundation as closely as possible to the row of cylinders. So what I'm going to do is take a short, sharp pair of scissors, and I'm holding the scissors sort of perpendicular. The blade, the surface of the blade is perpendicular to the surface of the beading foundation, and I'm making sure that the top jaw of the scissors is going to be resting right against the cylinder beads in the bezel so that I can get the closest cut possible to the beads without cutting any of my threads. I'll turn this a little bit so you can see a little better. By keeping the blade perpendicular, I'm making sure not to cut underneath the bezel so I don't cut the threads that are used to hold the initial row of cylinder beads in place. Okay, so it doesn't matter if it's a little bit jagged. You're going to be adding beads right up next to it, so you can trim it a little bit if it really bothers you, but it'll be okay even if you have some pieces sticking out. And if you look at the back side, you can see there that with that technique of keeping the scissors perpendicular, I didn't cut any of the threads. All right, so now we're going to take our template and we're going to place our bezel down on the template, right where it says 30mm bezel in that large circle. Oops, this was my tail thread. Just going to trim it off. So right in the middle of the circle, you can see there's this pink, sort of pink line on the outside of the 30mm bezel. That designates where the 11As are going to get stitched later. I'm going to be covering up a little bit of it, but I know it's there. You'll see in the directions what to do to the outside of that line. But basically, I'm lining up my bezel so the facets of my stone line up the way I like them. I actually like them to be sort of the points of the square facets. I like to be north, south, west, east. If you want to, you can line it up differently. You can line it up so that the squares are sort of the sides of the squares are north, south, west, east. But I like it oriented this way. And you can use that line down the center of the template as a guide to make sure that your bezel's lining up perfectly straight. And then from there, I'm just going to take my thread that's remaining and start stitching this piece on the black beading foundation to the template. And I'm doing that by stitching through the beading foundation on the very edge. So I've just cut a little bit of the black beading foundation, and then I'm sort of stitching down like a couple beads width away from where I came up to make a little stitch to the template. And I'm leaving enough space around this outside edge here to, I'm going to be backstitching a row of 11As there, so I'm making sure to leave enough space for that, for when that part comes into play. I'm going to try to get all my beadwork onto the dark gray part of the template. I don't want to have to stitch onto the white at all, so I need enough space for those beads. I'm just holding this very tightly in place as I work so it doesn't rotate or shift. I try to do at least a dozen or so stitches around, so this is held very nicely in place. The point of doing this, rather than just stitching the bezel directly onto the template beading foundation, is just to raise the height of the stone a little bit so it matches up better with the height of the pear stone. Ouch. Okay, so I just stitched this guy in place. It looks pretty straight to me. So I'm going to put my thread down for now. Next, you'll need to set the pear stone in its setting. Take the stone and place it point side down into the setting. Shove the settings with the prongs up. And if you pick up the whole thing, you'll see that the edge of the stone doesn't really go down into the setting. It sort of rests on the top edge of the setting with the prongs extending beyond that outside edge of the stone. So what I like to do is make sure this is sort of evenly set in on all sides, meaning there's a sort of equal amount of color showing on the outside edge. And then hold it in place while I take a pair of pliers, place the bottom jaw of the pliers on the underside of the prong that I'm going to push down, and the top jaw of the pliers on the prong I'm going to push down, and then squeeze and push the prong onto the surface of the stone, and then rotate and do the next prong. Rotate and do the next prong. Rotate again and do the next prong. And then just double check all the prongs are completely flat on the surface of the stone. Now I need to take this pear stone and set it in place in the setting where indicated on the template, and then sew it in place. So this one can be tricky to kind of hold in place while you sew it down, but just try to hold it with your thumb and hold your fingers on the back side of your template such that it won't move, and then stitch up from the back to the front of the template close to the closest hole, where closest to where your thread already is. And then with this top set of holes, you might not be able to stitch all the way across because the back of the stone is sort of interfering with a straight line from one set of holes to the other on the other side. So you might have to kind of angle your needle down and stitch down so your needle comes through the back side. I just felt my stone shift. Gotta try to reorient it. Now I'm going to kind of try to find that second hole. If you can't do it from the inside out, you can always come back to the outside like this, the outside of that next hole, and then stitch down through the hole and through the non-woven stitching base to the back side. All right, now that I've got 2 stitches to kind of hold it in place, I'm going to reorient it, make sure it's lined up, and I'm making sure it's right up against the bezel in this spot here. And then I'm going to try to make it out that hole. I made it from the middle out, going from the back side to the front. And make sure each hole has a couple threads going through it and attaching it to the template. Alright, so that top set of holes is pretty secure. Gonna make sure my stone is oriented with the point lined up real nicely, and then stitch this bottom set of holes to the template. And you can stitch straight through the bottom set of holes usually, because the back of the stone isn't as deep there. Do once more for good measure. Alright, the next step is to add the 6mm and 4mm pearls on either side of the pear stone. The places for these are marked with little numbers. They might be kind of hard to see, but there's a 6 here, sort of in the corner, where the pear stone and the bezel meet, and then there's 4 4s. Basically, we start with the 6mm and then add 4 4mm pearls till we get down to this area here. So I'm actually gonna start on this side first because my thread is closer to that side by just working my way up to where the 6 is, making little stitches as I go. Alright, and then I'm just coming out somewhere close to the 6, right up next to the bezel. I'm going to pick up a 6mm pearl and stitch down about a 6mm pearl's width away, and then come back up and stitch through it again, and then down into the beading foundation again. So I've stitched it to the template twice. And I'm going to bring my thread up right after the 6mm pearl so I can add my 4mm pearls, and I'll just back stitch these in one at a time, making sure they're tight up against the 6mm pearl and up against the pear stone. And I'm going to sort of go from one to the next as I back stitch them in place. running out of thread. I think I can get the last one in there before I have to add thread. Yeah. Okay. So I've got those, the 6 and the 4.4mm pearls. I'm going to add more thread and that'll do the same thing on the other side of the pear stones, starting with the 6mm pearl and working down toward the point. Once you have both sides of pearls added, you're going to work down in this area to establish a little section of 4 ginkgo beads in this sort of formation. There's a little extra space down at the bottom of the template that if you have space left afterwards, you're going to cut it away, but it's because you may end up with your pear stone further down or further up than mine. It just allows a little wiggle room for the bottom part of this formation of 4 ginkgo beads. So you're going to kind of eyeball where the first one is going to go. It's going to fit right up between the bottom 2 4mm pearls. There should be a little space between there. The point of the ginkgo bead is going to be touching with the point of the pear setting. And once you kind of have that in place, that'll help you to be able to know where to put your needle, to bring your needle up to the surface right near one of the holes. And then stitch through that hole. And stitch straight down on the other side of the hole to ensure that that ginkgo bead's going to stay right where you put it. Why are you not focusing, camera? Come on. There we go. And we'll do the same thing with the other hole. Okay, and then just make sure to stitch through those holes at least once more each. Alright, and then to add the next couple ginkgo beads, I actually like to start with my thread coming out of one of the holes of this first one. So I'm going to stitch through the left-hand hole of this next ginkgo bead and then the right-hand hole of a second one. And I'm saying left-hand, right-hand with them oriented the same as the first. So what that'll do is it'll allow me to sort of form them up here into this nice little gathering. And then I'm actually gonna make sure this guy's sort of in this along the center. Then bring my thread up to go up through this left-hand hole of the bottom one. And then stitch through the right-hand hole of a last fourth one, and then through the left-hand hole of the top one in the formation. Okay, so now they're like all stacked together. I'm going to stitch down into the beading foundation. And now I have to proceed to stitch down each of these holes individually to the beading foundation by bringing my thread up real close to where those holes start. And then stitching through and oops. and then stitching down right at the end of that hole through the beading foundation. So I'm going to do that with each hole on each bead. Kind of have to angle, like to bend my my beading foundation like this sometimes to be able to get my needle on these tough spots. I think I stitched each hole down individually. Oh no, not this one maybe. Okay, so I will end up having to trim away some of this non-woven down here, the template down here. I'm going to basically just trim to the outside of where these ginkgo beads are, being careful not to cut the threads later on. But for now, I'm going to ignore that. I'm going to work my way up to here. We're going to back stitch a line of 11 A's all the way around the bezel from one 6mm purl around to where the second 6mm purl is. So to work my way up there, I'm going to just make these little stitches from back to front, sort of a running stitch to get from one spot to the next. And bring my thread up right next to the black beading foundation that my bezel is attached to. And then I'll just start back stitching groups of 11 A's. And these can, you can add these in groups of 2 at a time, or 3 at a time, or 4 at a time. Doesn't really matter how many, because you're not going to be using these to bezel off of. You're just creating a row of backstitched beads. So I usually do 3 or 4 at a time. Alright, so I'll keep going all the way around till I meet up with this purl. Once you've got the line of backstitched 11 A's all the way around the bezel from one 6mm purl to the other, you're going to need to cut out your template on the outside edge. So where you have beads already down here and here, you're going to need to cut right up against those beads. But then elsewhere you can cut on the outside of the dark shape. So I'm going to start down here, and I'm going to use the same method as before, where I line up my scissors sort of perpendicular to the surface. And then, so see, I had to cut away a little extra down here because my beads didn't go quite as far down as I thought they might. And then I'm just tracing this line up to here, and I'm going to just cut up right to the edge of these beads. Try not to cut any thread. And then go back to cutting on the line until I get down here. And I'm just going to cut around the bottom edge of those beads. Alright, correction, it's not a magic marker, it's a Sharpie. I'm just going to take a black Sharpie and color the edge. Make sure I don't have any white beading foundation showing. Okay. Once you have all your bead embroidery parts done, before you add your edge beads, something I forgot to film, if you have your template, say I did all the beading here, the bezel, the pear stone, the pearls, and the ginkgo beads down here. Once all that's done, if you plan on using the ultra suede for your backing, place your template down on the ultra suede. Once you have this all trimmed around your beadwork and this template shape isn't going to change anymore, place it down in your ultra suede and trace around the edge with a thin marker or pen. Just being very careful to get that as exact as possible, because what's going to happen is I'm going to cut and it's going to be this shape. And I'm going to say that this is the glue side, just so I remember later on. And I'm going to try to cut away the black part of my line so that I'm just going to be left with the inside part, which should theoretically line up perfect with where the template is trimmed to, and subsequently it'll line up with where the edge beads fall. We're adding the edge beads. Okay, so I've cut just about all of the black away and just checking to see if this matches up. It's a pretty good match. So I'm going to save this guy for attaching later on. Now I'm going to be adding edge beads. I'm going to be using my 11B and my 15O. And I want to start down at the very bottom and place two 11Bs at the very bottom tip, and then work up one side, then up the other side. So my thread is way up here. Gonna have to just do some of those small stitches, do like a running stitch to work my way down toward the bottom point. And I'm going to bring my thread out just to one side of center. I'm trying to imagine two 11Os sitting on that bottommost point there. So I'm going to pick up two 11Bs. And I'm going to stitch through the edge from back to front, or you can do front to back, it doesn't really matter. A little to the other side of center, and then I'm going to stitch back through that second bead. So that bead sits on the edge. That's the brick stitch thing. This bead's not going to sit quite nicely until I come around again, come up through that bead again. But then from here, I'm going to pick up a 15A, stitch through the edge. I'm just going back to front and being consistent. I'm going to do that with every stitch. And then stitch through that bead again. Then I'll do an 11B. So I'm stitching close to the edge, but not close enough that my thread's going to come through and split the beading foundation. and I'm stitching back through that 11B, and then a 15A, sorry, 15O, and then an 11B. I'm just going to keep adding this brick stitch edging until I reach all the way up to this top point here, and then I'll stop. Once you make it all the way up to like the top center or close to the top center of adding the edge beads, you're going to want to stop there. So stitch back through the last edge bead you added, but then stitch down into the one before that. So in this case, the last one I added was an 11B, and I'm stitching into a 15O, and then stitch into the beading foundation, and then however you can sort of work your way back down to the bottom point down here. So I'm just going to kind of skim my way along the back surface of the beadwork to quickly get down there. Alright, and then once down there, stitch through the edge of the template close to the first bead you picked up, the first 11B, and then stitch out through it. And then start adding edge beads. Next is a 15O. Start adding them, working in the other direction. So you'll be working, you worked this half before, now you'll be working this half up to the top point, alternating between the 11Bs and the 15Os. Once you've made it all the way from the other side of the bottom point up to the top, if your beads don't line up exactly perfectly, like how this situation I've gotten myself into here, you're going to need to make a decision. I can either try to just stitch into this 11B from the 15O and kind of pull it toward it, or I can try to fill this in with a bead. So I think I can actually add an extra 15O here in this space. And then I'll just have two little 15Os at the top rather than one. That's okay. And then you're going to stitch down into that last edge bead that was left from the first side you completed. And then through the beading foundation, and then back out that edge bead to straighten that edge bead out. Alright, and then we gotta travel back down here once again, so stitch into the previous edge bead and then into the beading foundation. And just work your way. Just gonna work my way down to that bottom point once again. You can also always stop the thread, start a new thread down closer to the bottom if you don't want to bother with this sort of thing. And then once down here, bring your thread out of one of the 15Os to either side of center. Alright, now pick up a 15O, stitch into the next 11B on the edge. And now you might have a little room for like one seed bead in this spot here. You can add whatever color you like, but I actually like to add an 11A. So add an 11A and just stitch down into the beading foundation here. So it just puts it right in that spot. And then I'm going to stitch out through the next 15O on the edge. And then I'm going to pick up a 15O, stitch into the next 11A edge bead. then immediately stitch out through the next 15 edge bead since I don't have room to add any beads there. And then I'm going to pick up a 15 and stitch into the next 11B edge bead. I said 11A before, sorry, that was a slip. 11B. So now in this spot, this is where I'm going to add my first sort of long striped line of beads of the different colors. So I'm going to go from this edge bead to this spot out here. I'm going to be stitching down like that, right up next to the pearl and the ginkgo beads. And I'm going to start with my 11 Bs. So I'm probably going to be able to add 2 11 Bs. I think 2 11 Cs, 1 11 D, and 1 11 E. So it's sort of up to you how many of each color bead you add for this step. But I like to add more beads than what can fit flat when I'm adding the 11 O's so that they puff up a little bit, they give a little bit more texture. And now I've stitched it down from front to back, right up next to the pearl and the ginkgo beads. And when I pull tight, I have my line of beads there. Now I'm going to stitch up close to where I stitched in, but I'm leaving just a little bit of room for 15 0. And I'm going to pick up enough 15 O's to reach out to the next 15 0 edge bead if they lie flat. So, oops, I think that's enough there. So I'm going to stitch out through the 15 0 edge bead. And those are pretty flat, so that's good. Now I'm going to pick up another 15 0 and stitch into the next 11B on the edge. And do the same thing. I think you can fit the same number of beads as the first little row of these guys. So I'm going to pick up 2 11Bs, 2 11Cs, 1 11D, and 1 11E. And stitch down. So the 11 rows kind of puff up a little bit from the surface. I like that. And then I'm going to stitch out right next to where I stitched in and pick up enough 15 O's to lie flat. And stitch out through the 15 0 edge bead. So I'm going to continue this, working my way up this way, using these lines drawn on the template as sort of a guide for the angle of my rows of beads. You don't have to have rows of beads directly on those lines. They're just to try to angle your beads that way. Once you've done that side, you come back and do the second side the same way, and I like to try to make the rows symmetrical. So I've worked my way all the way up to this point here and just filled in all the remaining space where I could see the template with beads. So as you have to reduce the number of 11 O's you're using in each 11 O row, as you get up here, you have to decide which color you want to use. I chose to continue just using 11 C's once I got to the point where I could only use one bead. So now I have to weave my thread from up here down to this point to start over, adding the 15 O's on the outside edge and the lines of beads. So I'm going to do the skim thing again. And I'm bringing my thread out of the first 15 0 to the other side of center. I'm going to pick up a 15 0, stitch through the next 11B, and I'm going to pick up one 15A to fill in this little spot because I want to do the same thing I did on this side, make it symmetrical. And then I'm coming out the next 15 0 on the edge, pick up a 15 0, go into the 11B. Can't add anything there, so I'm just going to go back out the next 15 0, Pick up a 15 out, and then this is where I'm going to start picking up my beads to match these rows. I'm actually going to look at what I added here and add the exact same thing as on this side. So that was 2 11 B's, 2 11 C's, 1 11 D, and 1 11 E. And stitching down. Gonna have a symmetrical row of beads there. So then I'll just keep going, working my way up, trying to match these rows till I get up to this spot here. Next you need to weave down to the bottom tip again to add the mermaid scale. So I'm gonna work my way down. And bring my thread out of one of these 11 B's on the bottom. I'm going to pick up 8 11 A's, and I'm going to pass through, let's see which side I'm on the right hand 11 B, so I'm going to pass through the right hand hole of the front side of the mermaid scale, and then pick up 7 11 A's. I'm going to bring these all down to next to the edge bead, and then I'm going to stitch back through the first 11A added, then through the 11B edge bead. Then I'm going to stitch out the adjacent 11B edge bead. Come on. There we go. And I'm going to do the same thing but with the second hole. So I need to pick up 8 11A's. And I'm going to stitch through the left hand hole from front to back of the mermaid scale. Turn this over and then pick up 7 11A's. And I'm going to stitch through the first 11A added, and then the 11B edge bead. Pull that tight. Alright, so now the mermaid scale is attached. I'm going to retrace the thread path through each of those connections to reinforce. Find the top 5 or 6 11B edge beads. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think that these top 5 are the center ones. Yeah, so that means this guy and this guy. Or is it this guy? Yeah, this is like the center one. So 2, 3, 4, 5. So find the top 5 11 B's that are sort of centered, and start a new thread and bring it out of a bead to the left or the right. Bring it out of an 11B to the left or the right of that group of 5 or 6 11B's. It's just sort of giving you a spacing. 5 or 6 beads, 11B's between places where you're going to create these side components is a good amount of space. In this sample, there's 6 11B's between the first connection points of the side pieces, but that's okay. Every piece is a little different, so on this one I have 5 11B's between. Now I'm going to pick up 3 11A's, a ginkgo, and my ginkgo beads in this case I want to be facing with the rounded side up. I'm going to be using 4 of them this way, so I'm just going to kind of lay them out here. I'm going to pick up my first ginkgo from the right hole with the point down, and then a second ginkgo from the left hole with the point down, and then a third ginkgo from the right hole with the point down. And I'm going to bring these down. Now I'm going to pick up 3 11As and stitch through the second hole of this last ginkgo bead. Here we go. Now I'm going to pick up this 4th ginkgo bead, going down through the right hole with the point facing down, and then I'm going to stitch into the second hole of that 1st ginkgo bead. Alright, so now I have those in that little group of 4. Now I'm going to pick up 4 11As and stitch into the next 11B edge bead. And I'm angling this so that I can make sure I catch some of the template as well. Now I'm going to stitch back through that first 11B edge bead. And I'm going through a little bit of the template as well when I do that. And then I'm going to stitch through those first 3 11As. Now I'm going to pick up 4 11As and stitch into the outside hole of that second ginkgo bead. Then pick up 4 11As and stitch through these 3 11As on top of that ginkgo bead that's on top of this configuration. Then I'm going to pick up 4 11As again and stitch through down through the outside hole of that 4th ginkgo bead. And then I'm going to pick up 4 more 11As and stitch into the 4 11As and the 11B here. Get entangled. Alright, now I'm going to go through this 11B on the edge again. Then through all of these 11As up to this point. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of them. Then I'm going to pick up 4 11As and stitch through the 11 beads here, the 11As. Pick up 4 more 11As and stitch through these 8 11As. And into that 11B edge bead. And now I'm just going to go through and reinforce some of these thread paths. I'm going to go through this loop of the 11As on the outside again, and I'll probably go up and down, like up through the ginkgo beads, through the 3 11As here and back down into the edge beads to reinforce. And then I'll come over, I'll work my thread over to this side, to the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, this bead here. It's the 6th bead away, so I'll start my connection there and make the same component in mirror image right here. Once you have both of your side components done, you can figure out your backing for your piece. So if you wanted to put the ultra suede on, you got your piece set aside from before. You're going to spread some fabric glue onto the back of your template where all the threads are. And my fabric glue bottle tip is long since been clogged up, so I just use a paintbrush or any kind of whatever I have nearby that can sort of spread the glue onto the back, making sure I get right up to those edge beads. Yeah, I like to do a nice thick layer of the glue. This is a water-based fabric glue, so it really loses a lot when it dries. You can use E6000. You don't need as much if you're going to use E6000. You can do a nice thin layer. I do not recommend super glue for this because it's going to make the ultra suede very hard to stitch through in the spots where the super glue is adhered. Alright, now once you have all your glue spread on your back, you're going to very carefully place your pre-cut ultra suede down, matching up the edges. And just check all the way around that the edge beads peek out from behind the edge of the ultra suede, because the edge should sort of match up with the template edge. Then you're going to allow that to dry. Once your glue on your ultra suede is dry, start a new thread or use an existing working thread and bring it out of an edge bead. Now this step is to help physically attach the ultra suede to the edge beads. I'm basically going to be attaching every other edge bead. So stitch down through the next edge bead, then stitch through the ultra suede and the non-woven stitching base, making sure I'm not stitching through any beads here. And then stitch out through the next edge bead. So I'm going down through an edge bead, stitching through, so I'm kind of stitching at an angle in the direction I'm working a little bit, stitching through both layers, and then out through that next edge bead. So this will basically attach every other edge bead to the ultra suede. And if you want to, you can go through and attach every single bead to the ultra suede by repeating the thread path of the brick stitch edging. So by essentially doing brick stitch without adding any beads, just going through the thread path that would be there. But I find that too time consuming. It's just frustrating, so I use this method to attach every other. Alright, so do that all the way around, then the ultra suede will be securely attached to the base on the edges. An alternative method for covering the back side of your bead embroidery is to use a fabric paint like this tulip slick dimensional fabric paint, or puffy paint, or any kind of t-shirt sort of paint you can get at a craft store. And you can actually just spread a bunch onto the back of your template, and use a paintbrush to spread it around and make sure it covers up all the threads, and make sure you reach out to the edge and just be very careful not to get it on the beads if possible. So what this does is it's basically a pigmented glue in essence, because it has a lot of dimension to it. It's very thick. It dries basically in the same with the same thickness, just about as when it's wet. So there's a lot of body to it, and it effectively seals the threads on the back of the piece so that they won't come unraveled, and it creates a more even surface on the back as well. Of course, it's not going to be as perfect of a surface as fabric like ultra suede is, but if you absolutely hate adding ultra suede after you have your edge beads on and then having to stitch through the edge beads a second time to physically sew the ultra suede in place, this is might be a good option for you. And I recommend doing at least 2 coats of this if you're going to use this method, just to make a nice thick and even layer. The more coats you can get on there, the more even it's going to be. Kind of like if you're doing lacquer on a piece of like a wood project. The first coat of this will soak into the Peltex quite a bit. The Peltex is the fabric that I make the templates from. Okay, so I'm just kind of spreading out the excess now. I got all the edges up to the edge beads. And I'll let that dry before adding a second layer. And then really it just ends up being kind of like a smooth plasticky sort of surface on the back, because you're sealing up all the threads. To start the neck strap, you're going to have both a right hand neck strap and a left hand neck strap. So for the right hand neck strap, you're going to pick up 4 11As, 111B, 111C, 111D, and 111E. Bring them down toward the end of your thread, but leave about a 12-inch tail for attaching to the necklace later on. Stitch through the first 4 beads, the 4 11As, again to form a loop, and then orient your beads so the 11B, C, D, and E are to the right, and the 4 11As, which are the core beads of your spiral rope, are to the left. Now pick up another 11A, 11B, 11C, 11D, and 11E. Stitch through the top 3 11As, so the top 3 beads in the core. And then through the 11A just added. Make sure the 11B, 11C, 11D, and 11E go to the right. And keep repeating this process. Picking up an 11A, 11B, 11C, and 11D, and 11E. And going up through the top 3 beads in the core. And then stitching through that newly added 11A. You can see your stitches are starting to stack up. So repeat until your right hand neck strap half is the desired length. Once your right hand neck strap half is the length that you want it to be, needle up the tail thread, that 12 inches of tail thread you left, and stitch through the center 11A on the end of the right hand side component. So this is the component that will be on the right side of the necklace when you're wearing it. So I'm picturing wearing it like this, looking down at it like this. My right hand will be on this side. So I'm stitching through that guy. And then back through the last 3 11As in the core of the spiral rope. And I want to make sure I'm sort of working so that I can see that first stitch there. Now I'm going to pick up 111B, 111C, and 111D. And I'm going to pass up through the last 2 11As in the core of the spiral rope. And then push these beads to the left. Then I'm going to pick up 111A and 111B. And stitch through this center 11A in the side component, making sure I'm stitching through the left side of it so that those beads sit to the left. Now I've got to retrace one of these thread paths through here, through one of these stitches at least once to reinforce this connection. You need definitely more than one pass of thread going through all this stuff. So I'll probably do both actually, if I can. If I can't do any more, that's okay. Just gonna go until I can. And now I'm just gonna weave down these 11As in the side component, making my way down to the edge beads, and down here I'm just gonna knot my thread, secure it, and weave it in and trim it. Then I'll repeat this process with the left hand neck strap half, attaching it to the left hand side component, and doing that same process of adding those 2 final stitches, but in mirror image to the first. To start the left hand neck strap half, pick up 4 11As, 111B, 111C, 111D, and 111E. Bring them down toward the end of the thread, leaving a 12-inch tail to attach to the left hand side component later. And then stitch through the 4 11As again to form a loop. Now for this side of the neck strap, you need to push the accent beads, the 11B, 11C, 11D, and 11E to the left. The core beads should be on the right. Push the accent beads to the left. Pick up 111A, 111B, 111C, 111D, and 111E. And stitch up through the top 3 beads in the spiral rope core, the top 3 11As. And then through the new 11A as well. Now push these new beads added to the left. So just continue on like that, each time picking up the same group of beads, the 11A, 11B, 11C, and 11D, and then stitching up through the top 3 11As in the core, then the fourth 11A, so the 11A just added, and then push the accent beads to the left. And if you do it this way every time, you'll end up with a spiral rope that's spiraling the opposite direction from the right hand next strap half, which is what you want. So just keep repeating this process until your next strap half is the desired length. To make the toggle bar, needle up a yard of thread and pick up 14 cylinders. Bring them down to the end of your thread. Leave just enough of a thread to weave into the beadwork later and trim. And then begin peyote stitching a row of cylinders with just flat peyote stitch by reversing direction and skipping over the last cylinder, then stitching through the one before that. Pick up a bead, skip over the next bead, and stitch through the one after that. So just do regular peyote stitch till you reach the end of the row. And then just keep peyote stitching rows until you have 5 edge beads on each side for a total of 10 rows. Once you have the 10 rows of peyote stitch, you'll zip this peyote strip into a solid tube to form the toggle bar by stitching alternately through beads in the first row and last row. So fold it up to bring the last row together to meet up with the first row, and then stitch through a bead in the first row, then a bead in the last row, then a bead in the first row and in the last row, and just keep going like that till you reach the end of the tube. And then once you get to the end, stitch through the adjacent cylinder in the second row just to bring those two end cylinders together so there's not a gap there. And then reverse direction and stitch out through an adjacent cylinder so your thread is coming out of the end of the tube. Pick up 1 15-0, 1 6mm purl, and 3 15-0s. Stitch back through the purl. Then pick up a 15-0 and stitch through a different cylinder on the end. Reverse direction and stitch through the next cylinder on the end. Then pick up a 15-0. Stitch through the 6mm purl. Then through all 3 15-0s on top of it. And then pick up a 15-0 and stitch into the next end cylinder. Then you've got to do one more pass through. Stitch through the next cylinder on the end. Pick up a 15-0. Stitch through the purl. Through all three 15-0s on top of the purl. Back through the purl. Through one of the 15-0s between the end of the toggle bar and the purl, and then into a cylinder on the end. And then work your way to the opposite end so you can repeat that same embellishment. Once you do, weave in, secure, and trim all your threads. Once the toggle bar is complete, return to your working thread on the end of the right hand neck strap half and pick up 16 11As. Stitch into the center of the toggle bar and catch either a bead or a stitch, like a piece of thread. I'm going to go through a bead and then stitch back, straight back through. And then stitch through the last of those 16 11As you picked up. Pick up 15 11As. And stitch through the 3 end 11As in the core of the spiral rope. Pick up 1 11D, 1 11C, and 1 11B. And stitch up through the group of 16 11As you added first. Then through the center of the toggle bar again. Catch your thread or a bead and stitch back through the toggle bar and through that last 11A. Then through the group of 15 11As. And through the first 2 11As in the end of the spiral rope in the core, and make sure the 3 beads you just added move to the right. Now pick up 1 11C and 1 11B. Make sure those stay to the right, and then stitch up through the group of 16 11As. I'm not sure which group it is actually, but I'm just going to have these lines of 11As to stitch through. Then through the center of the toggle bar once more. And catch a thread or a bead and back through the toggle bar and through the last 11A. Then through the second group of 11As. And into the end of the spiral rope. And I'm just stitching down a few beads. And then weave in, secure, and trim your thread. For the toggle loop, pick up 16 repeats of 111D and 111E for a total of 32 beads. Bring them down toward the end of your thread, leaving just enough of a tail to weave into your beadwork later and trim, and then stitch through the first couple beads again to form a loop. Make sure your thread is coming out of an 11D before you start the next step. Peyote stitch 1 round with 11Es. So pick up an 11E, skip the next 11E in the loop, and stitch through the 11D after that. And repeat this all the way around. After adding the last 11E in the round, step up through the first 11E added. Then peyote stitch around using cylinders. After adding the last stitch, step up through the first cylinder added. Then peyote stitch one more round with cylinders. Cut the last video. Once you reach the end of the round, step up through the first cylinder added in this round. Now this next round is going to be different because you're going to be adding 2 beads in certain spaces and 1 bead in the rest of the spaces. Pick up 2 cylinders and stitch through the next cylinder in the previous round. So you're adding 2 cylinders in 1 space, just 1 here. Then peyote stitch 4 cylinders normally, just individually. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now add 2 cylinders in this next space. So pick up 2 cylinders and stitch through the next cylinder from the previous round. And then peyote stitch 4 cylinders like normal. And once more, pick up 2 cylinders and stitch through the next cylinder in the round, adding 2 in that space. And then peyote stitch. You'll have room for 5 individual peyote stitches with cylinders. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And at the end of the round, don't step up. Instead, step down diagonally through 4 beads to bring your thread out of an 11E on the other side of the ring, and peyote stitch a round of cylinders there, just 1 in each space. After adding the final bead and peyote stitch, step up through the first cylinder added in this round, and then peyote stitch 1 final round of cylinders, just individually, 1 in each space. Once you reach the end of the round, step up through the first bead added And at this point, you'll zip your two sides of your toggle ring together. And now when you do the zipping, every time you encounter a pair of cylinders that were added at the same time, on the other side of the ring, there's 3 of these, you'll stitch through both cylinders in that pair as if they're one bead. So bring the 2 sides together and start stitching alternately through beads in the final row of cylinders on each side. And just make sure when you get to a pair of cylinders like this one here, stitch straight through both of them. And as you pull tight, this should zip into sort of a solid shape. Pull tight as you go. Don't leave all the tightening to the end because it won't tighten up as much that way. You'll notice once you finish zipping that you have there's sort of a 3-sided triangular shape with one side being longer. You'll attach the point across from the longer side to the end of the necklace. When you finish the zipping process, make sure your thread is coming out of a bead in the last row stitched, which would be second row out on one of the sides of cylinders. It's not going to be this outermost row that has the pairs of beads. It's going to be one back from that. Pick up 3 15-ohs and stitch through the next cylinder in the row. This is just an embellishment round to add some decoration. Pick up another set of 3 15-ohs and stitch through the next bead in the round. And just repeat this all the way around. Once you've got your groups of 3 15-ohs all the way around, you can weave in, secure, and trim both of your threads. Now pick up 111D, 111C, and 111B and stitch down through the top 2 11As in the core of the spiral rope. And make sure these newly added beads go to the left, so push them to the left. Then pick up 111C and 111B and stitch down through the top 2 at the end of the spiral rope. And then go through one of the groups of beads you just added. I'll pick these 2 since they're right there. Tighten that up and then retrace the thread path through the 11As added to the toggle loop. And you're going to trace the path one more time after this, so you have at least 3 passes of thread. just for extra security. And then once you've got the 3 passes of thread, you can either weave into the toggle to secure and trim your thread, or weave down into the spiral rope and make a half hitch knot or 2 within the spiral rope to secure it before trimming it. To attach your toggle loop to the end of the left hand neck strap half, go to your working thread on the end of the left hand neck strap half and pick up 10 11As. Then stitch through the pair of cylinders on the outermost round of cylinders. So it's that round sort of along the equator. It should be 1 round away from the round that has the 15 O's. And you want to choose the pair of cylinders. There's three pairs. You want to choose the one that is across from the longer side of the toggle. So if you can kind of straighten it out, figure out which side's the longest. It's definitely this one that has the 5 single cylinders between the pairs. And stitch through that pair of cylinders right across. Then pick up 10 more 11As. And stitch into the last 3 11As in the core of the left-hand spiral rope. Now pick up 111D, 111C, and 111B.